When implementing a new company in NAV, there are quite a lot of setup tables that you have to set up. Now, typically what you can do is go to your customer, start asking questions. Based on the answers that you get, start performing the setup manually. Now, with the questionnaires, we can automate this process. Let's have a look. So again, think of the sales and receivables setup, the general ledger setup, in which we have fields such as the local currency code and so on. So in order to know how or which parameters we need to set up, we need to ask questions to the customer. So we need to collect answers that we can use to set up these tables. Now, instead of asking these questions during, for example, a typical analysis interview, you can use questionnaires. So I can create questionnaires of all these different setup tables and send these questionnaires to the customer so that the customer can answer as much as possible of these questions, and then we can apply the answers in NAV. So let's have a look at how we can create a questionnaire. So first of all, you can see here that Kronos already has a default questionnaire created, and a questionnaire will have question areas. So if I click on question areas in the ribbon, you can see here that we already have question areas for the general ledger setup, the inventory setup, the purchases and payables setup, and so on. Now let's have a look how such a questionnaire looks like. So I can click here on edit in the ribbon, and there you can see now a typical questionnaire. Now, a questionnaire is always linked to a table, and typically a setup table, like in this case, the general ledger setup, table 98. And next, you will see that for all the fields that we have in table 98, we can ask a question. So remember, table 98, the general ledger setup, the first two fields that you see in the general fast tab are the fields allow posting from, allow posting to. And here you can see that my demo company Kronos is asking questions on these fields. And so if you want to limit the date interval for which posting is allowed and so on, enter the date here. Remember that there is also a field in which we have to specify the local currency. Here you can see question number 11, what is the currency code for the local currency? You see, we already have a field value, and that's of course because we're in an existing demo company, but in real life this would be blank so that the customer can enter his local currency. So, and that's the whole idea of these questionnaires. We will ask questions on all these setup fields and that we need to set up in the general ledger setup, in the sales and receivables setup, and so on. We can then send these questionnaires, for example, in Excel format to the customer, and they can start entering as many as possible of these questions, and then afterwards we can import them into NAV and apply answers. And I will provide an example in one of the other lessons in this module. Now, how can we create such a questionnaire? Let's create one from scratch, because here we are looking at already existing questionnaires, but suppose I want to add a new questionnaire, and I want to add the questionnaire of, let's say, the warehouse setup. So I will go to new. So I will call this warehouse setup. Then I will have to look for the table. So I will use the search function, and as you can see, the warehouse setup is table 5769. So I will select this table, there you go. And now we can start entering questions. Now the warehouse setup has many fields, and I can start entering these questions one by one, because you can see that the question is linked to a field ID. However, you can also use the update questions function. So by clicking here on this action, if I now click on OK, you will see that by default I now have a question for each field in the warehouse setup. And now I can start cleaning up the questionnaire, because there are probably some questions that you don't want to ask that doesn't make sense. Like, for example, the primary key. It doesn't make sense to ask a question on the primary key. So I can simply remove this question line. So I can click on delete line, and there you go. So the question is removed. So I can start renumbering my questions by saying, for example, this is now question 1, and so on. And then you can see here the question itself. Now, the question is always the field name, so the field caption with a question mark. In a lot of cases, you would like to rephrase, of course, the question itself. So, for example, which number format to use for, let's say, I will not spend too much time, but you get the idea, so I can rephrase the question, which number format do you want to use for numbering the warehouse receipts, for example. So that would already be a better question to ask. Then you can see the answer option based on the field type. You can provide an answer. I can provide the default answer. You can see the field value. We can add a reference if you want, and then the field name and the field caption, you see. So that's how we can create questionnaires from scratch ourselves. So first of all, define or specify the table, the setup table for which you want to create a questionnaire. Then you might want to use the update question functions to automatically insert a question on all fields of the setup table. Then you probably might want to remove existing some fields for which it doesn't make sense to ask questions on. And then you could rephrase some questions in order to make it more efficient and easier to use the questionnaire. So once that these questionnaires are created, we can start using them. And that's something, again, like I just said, I will do in the upcoming lessons. So we will export to Excel, answer some questions, and then import back from Excel.